that we're being recorded and there's a transcript of the work, and then I dismiss those notifications. If that comes up for you, you can just click dismiss,
Okay.
and then you can take it away.
Awesome. So thank you so much for having me here. I've actually I know a lot about your group from all the conversation I've had with my wife all of last week. She could not you know she could not stop what she said. She had a lot of cool things to actually share with me. So I really I feel like I've already been I know you all and I've been with you for more than a week. So as I mentioned before, my name is Bhaskar. I am a program manager for a new program at NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. The new program is called Adaptation Science, ADSci for short. So I started that position about 6 months ago, before which for 17 years I was working for the state of Maryland. I was heading a group called Shoreline Conservation Service. So this is my full name. Um, I tell folks all the time that once I knew how to actually spell my first and last name, I just had X, Y, and V to learn in the alphabet. I have everything else in my in my name. So my topic today is mimicking nature, living shorelines in Maryland. Um, so I was looking up some information about trails, and I really one thing that I saw that uh, caught my attention immediately was how this project is trying to level the playing field in enhancing underserved and underrepresented high schools and capacity to pursue STEM. This is leveling the playing field is something that in 17 and a half years of my career I've been trying to do exactly that, and so this gravitated me immediately to this project. Now I also saw on your website, Todd, that under different features of trails, you have engineering design, scientific inquiry, biomimicry, and 3D printing. So I'm going to talk. My talk is going to be very it could come out of this topic of biomimicry. Now, before I go too much into what I mean by that, I wanted to give you a primer of what the issue is. As engineers, as engineering students, and as teachers, you like to know what the problem is first, right? So, wanted to actually quickly set the stage, about what I'm going to be talking today. Now, usually these projects that are, the living shoreline projects that I just mentioned are what we call mimicking nature's infrastructure. And why do we put these projects on the ground? The first and foremost reason is that somebody has a waterfront property and their shoreline is eroding at a pace that is actually really threatening their investment. So that's where I usually come into picture. Now, so that's why I wanted to actually make sure that I set the stage up. Even though erosion is a problem, it is not a bad thing per se, because you need erosion to continue to happen so that beaches are maintained, marsh and offshore habitats are maintained. And if you look at an estuary like Chesapeake Bay, you need that. The erosion is an important aspect for the ecological health of the estuary. Now, in Maryland, we have about almost 7,000 miles of shoreline, and the shoreline are continually eroded by water, waves, wind, and so we have about 23 counties in Maryland, of which 16 of them are coastal counties. And in each of these counties, each of these wherever water touches land, there is usually one of three things happening. One is erosion, which is basically loss of land, lot and then the opposite of erosion is accretion, and that is deposition of material on somebody's property. Now, the third possibility is that it's seasonal. It, some, say summer months, it brings in winter months it goes out. And so traditionally, what people have done is they've tried to actually, protect their property by the engineering practices that you see on the screen right now. The one on the left is called revetment, just putting rock on the eroding bank. And then bulkheads, which is basically wooden structures, as seawalls to prevent further erosion. In some cases, people have gone overboard and put, ripraps on top of revetments, top of bulkheads and bulkheads on top of revetments. Basically, they've tried to build, the Great Wall of China on the Maryland coastline. I wanted to draw some attention to this slide here. These so-called structural approaches have, we've seen, these pictures that you see here are typically what you see on a shoreline, because typically what these structural approaches are doing is they're trying to fight nature instead of working with it. Now, again, when I give this information, I also try to actually, give a different perspective of when I talk about erosion. It's not a monolithic block. It's, there are different rates of erosion. And usually when I just, throw numbers at people, like some of them understand, some of them don't. I like to relate some, the concept pictures. And so that's why this slide and the next slide will tell you more about what I mean by slight erosion. Slight erosion is anywhere from 0 to 2 feet per year. Though it sounds a lot, it is the normal cost of doing business in the water. A 2 to 4 feet erosion would look like what you see on the picture. You see blocks of, the bank actually getting disconnected from the shoreline. You have moderate erosion where there's bigger, you see the log that's actually stuck underneath, huge erosion. And then you have high erosion rate, which is 8 feet per year or above. And you see bluffs actually just collapsing under its own weight. Now, back in 2006 in Maryland, Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences did a study for us, for the state of Maryland, where they basically said all of these erosion that you see, if you really, focus really hard on this, you'll see that almost 87% of the shoreline experience slight or no erosion at all. Now, in my previous job, my role, number one, was to assess property owners who have, waterfront property owners who experience erosion on their property. It could be private or public, county-owned property and things like that. And the second goal was to make sure that the natural resources for the Chesapeake Bay and the coastal bays are protected. Now, my program, in my old previous program, we did both structural projects and living shoreline projects. And this slide, one slide, it speaks volume of how if you go with nature, you get a lot of co-benefits. Now this slide, like I said, we have almost the same number of structural projects and living shoreline projects. If you look at any of the other line items, you'll see that, for the same number of projects, you get more bang for the buck in terms of linear, in terms of how much marsh you've created. Living shorelines, it's about 3.8 million, square feet of marsh created as compared to 12,400. And then the other thing is, look at the costs that it is, the amount of state funds that were actually used to do these projects. It's almost 1/10. It's 3.9, almost $4 million to do these 480 projects, whereas it's almost $32 million. If you ask my wife, she'll tell you I'm a cheapskate. So I always like to do projects that are more affordable and more bang for the buck rather than just going and doing projects just for the sake of it. Now, if you take a closer look at living shorelines itself, this is a concept that was actually founded by a person named Ed Garvish. That's a really nice story with him. His mother's side was the Chrysler family. So he had money, no doubts about it. And he was this really amazing chemist, scientist that had access to land and access to money. So he tried different things on his property, and that's probably around 72, 73 is when he actually came upon this concept of living shorelines by trial and error. Now, living shorelines, so many different folks, different agencies have different definitions for it. The definition that I've and I've used in my career is it's a suite of techniques that minimizes erosion and maintains coastal process. There is a conundrum right there. If you look at it, erosion is a coastal process. So what we're trying to do is we're not trying to stop the coastal process, but we're trying to minimize erosion, and helping to protect people's property. Now, just to set the stage, I just wanted to, put some pictures in here. There are so many different ways to actually, get to where we want to go. And one thing that I always tell folks that each shoreline is so uniquely different from the other. So you want to actually use something on one shoreline that suits that place and not something else. So for instance, the living shoreline concept is basically to try to mimic nature, try to actually, enhance the natural environment, marshes, dunes, wetlands. Basically, that's what nature always has gone to when it's trying to protect its shorelines. A great example is when Hurricane Katrina happened in Louisiana. The impact that Katrina had on in New Orleans was very, very profound. And it's not like they've not had a hurricane before. They've had hurricanes before. But what was different with Katrina is the natural marshes that used to be there that protected those communities, the sponges, they were the shock absorbers for these communities. They were lost because of shipping activities. So that was why that event had a profound effect as compared to anything else that happened in the past. Now, so what we are trying to do with Living Shoreline is to mimic nature and try to put back systems in place that can actually fend for itself. Like I said, there are so many ways to get to that place. This one is, when you have a low energy environment, having what are called biologs, coconut fiber logs, as the first line of defense to actually absorb the energy and have a marsh that it can support for a short period of time. This is how a biolog project looks in action. And these biologs usually stay, depending on the system it's put in, it can stay on for probably 2 to 3 years, after which those biologs are disintegrated becomes part of the system itself, whereas the marsh behind it takes over that role. The other technique is to actually use what are called groins, which are basically rock structures going, perpendicular to the shoreline, and having, between two of those groin structures having or creating a marsh. And this is an example how that project looks after it's put on the ground. In some cases, when a project is done really well, I want to draw your attention to the picture on the right. You don't see the groin much at all because the grasses actually take over. The marsh is so strong, so well maintained that it actually takes over. The other option is what are called sills, which is basically putting the rock structure in front of parallel to the shoreline, being that first line of defense. These are put in areas where there's a little bit more, energy in the system. And this is how it looks, once it's all said and done. Wanted to show you a picture of a sill project before the project was done and after. And this is, the big one, the breakwaters, which are basically put 50, 60 feet into the water, really big structures, trying to break those big wave energy coming and hitting it. And, basically when these breakwaters are put in, they protect the sand dunes behind it. Again, I don't want to, give too much information or bore you to, to death with all this information. But there are some physical advantages of living shorelines, like breaking wave energy, maintaining a natural system. And there are biological advantages of it. Typically, when you put a living shoreline project in, you're basically creating a marsh or creating a dunal system, basically creating a habitat that, crabs can use them, turtles and all of them. So what you're trying to do is you're basically maintaining a link, a really nice transition zone from the upland to the shoreline to the water. Now, there are some limitations. They're not effective in all situations. I would not put a project, say, for instance, the Baltimore Harbor. The water is really, really deep offshore. And, you can put a living shoreline, but it's going to be extremely cost prohibitive. The other problem is, there is not many literature out there, peer-reviewed literature out there. And, and again, you're still fighting with this perception of structural projects, doing better. That's a concept, that perception that contractors have. And so there's always this tension between, do we have enough contractors can actually to put these projects on the ground? Now, really quickly, couple of slides here. I wanted to show you how projects in Maryland are performing. So back in 2006, I went around, the eastern shore of Maryland, looking at about 200 plus living shoreline projects. And I did an assessment study. So that was done in 2006. This is almost 16 years later. That is the biggest data set in the country. What I did was I wanted, we've been talking about these living shoreline projects for so long, but we did not have good information as to how these projects work. So basically what I did was I went to these projects and I looked at three parameters. One, is that shorelines continuing to erode? Two, whatever structure was put in, how are they performing? Are they in place? Are they doing what they were supposed to do? And third is all of these projects we planted, marsh grasses. And so during my assessment study, I wanted to actually go and see how these projects are doing and how these the marsh grasses that we planted were thriving. Now, if you look at the left and right picture, you can tell very clearly that you have a marsh that has no erosion on the left, whereas on the right side you have a marsh that's almost eroded. More than 50% of that marsh that was created has eroded back. The structure in this case, the left one is doing good. They're doing excellent. The structure that was put in place is exactly where it was. Whereas on the right side, nature has actually found ways. Maybe the construction was not good, or there's been a blowout in an area. So it has created a pocket where the structure is actually displaced. You can see my favorite site is the one on the left, because you've seen this picture twice now. So a project that has no invasive species. On the other hand, on the right side, you have everything but the grasses that was planted. So it's very clear which project actually functions better. Now, out of the almost 200 projects, my conclusion was about 131 of them were doing good or better. And human brain, we always try to find this one take-home message or one thing that we can actually look for, and that is, there are so many different kinds of projects, there are so many different settings, there are so many different contractors, but the one thing that actually decided whether a project succeeded or failed was the fact whether maintenance was done. Now, when you have nature as a huge component of your project, there is nothing called zero maintenance. So the one project that I showed you, your picture, the two slides that have the same picture, I did talk to the gentleman who owned the property, and his message to me was, I've already invested about $50,000 of my money onto this natural marsh, that we put in here, I consider my marsh to be an extension of my kitchen garden. So I go weed it. I try to make sure that it's well maintained really well. This is for something that I planted just for a summer. Whereas if I've done that for that, why would I not do something like that for my marsh that I spent about 40, 50 grand on? So that maintenance, that was the reason why that project actually succeeded. Now, this was done in 2006 and 2007, and that study actually went into into the law that Maryland passed in 2008, which is called the Living Shorelines Law. Basically, till that point in time, the living shoreline projects were recommended practice. Now, after 2008, it became a required practice. So for any property owner doing a shoreline project, they have to prove to the state that living shorelines would not work on their piece of property. The reason why we were able to actually pass that law is because we had data to back us by saying that living shorelines work really well in Maryland. And not only that, at that point in time, we've had many events, natural disaster, hazardous, extreme weather events that have challenged our systems. And Maryland has actually been either extremely lucky or extremely prepared, however you want to call it. And so we were able to pass the Living Shorelines Law in 2008. Now, I want to move that conversation slightly where, I like this slide a lot because, when I talk about living shorelines they did not look the same way all throughout, since from the 70s till today. I always tell the example of fiberglass boats. When the fiberglass boats were they were building them, they put a lot of material in it, and the whole idea was for the boat to actually float. The fiberglass boats of today are a lot lighter than the ones that were there, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Guess what? They still float, right? So the concept is less is more. That same concept can be adopted for Living Shoreline project. Let me give you two examples really quickly. This is how a typical Living Shoreline project back in the late 80s, early 90s looked like. This is a project, if you're going to Hooper's Island, in Lower Dorchester County, this is a site there. You can see how big the structures are, and then you see the marsh behind it. Now, that is how the projects used to look back in the days. And this is how projects look now. It's, you can see how, rock is still used in Living Shoreline project as a first line of defense, but instead of actually buttoning up every inch of that shoreline, you strategically place these materials so that you work, so nature actually works with this project to make it more resilient. I'm a numbers person. I like to actually, relate all my messaging through numbers. And so the next couple of slides should probably give you a little bit more clarity. Now, this project, you can see how this project used to look. There was a battered seawall. This shoreline was hit. It has a fetch. Fetch is basically distance open water. It had a southwest exposure of about 25 miles, and so this shoreline was getting battered. They put a seawall in there, but you can see how well the seawall is doing in that picture. Excuse me. And then you can see on the right side, the Living Shoreline project was actually put in place in 2003. And if you look at structural practices, these practices can range anywhere from $400 to $800 a linear feet. So I put the cost per linear feet in my slides so that you have a good understanding of, these projects don't have to actually, break the bank. So this project was completed at $375 a linear feet as compared to $400 to $800 for a seawall. And this shoreline on the right side looks almost the same. If you go today, this is what you're in 22, almost 19 years later. Now, this project is one of the projects that actually I would call it define my thinking, redefine my thinking in terms of living shoreline projects. Now, on the foreground, what you see is the salty, saline Chester River. On the back side, where it says protected shoreline, and behind that is a freshwater system called Hale Cove. Amazing habitat for SAV, and that is a great place for migratory waterfowl to actually congregate before they actually get back on their journey. Now, this project actually was done in 2006, 2007, when typically, there was that isthmus, that piece of land, the protected shoreline you see there, that was literally, what was actually separating the salty water, the saline water from the fresh water. And if that gets breached, the impact was going to be huge in terms of ecological impact to the freshwater system. So the question was, how do we protect this shoreline? Now, at that point in time, we said, okay, let's live the state of the art at that time was putting a sill. Let's put either a big sill or a huge breakwater there, and let's protect the shoreline. Cost of that estimate was about $4.5 million. Now, instead, what we did is again, going back to the not liking to spend money, we went and looked at it, and we basically challenged the engineer on this project and said, nah, this is too much. We got to dial back the cost. We got to do something else. So after many, many iterations, after many discussions, we realized that you see those headland control structures that are in the forefront. So basically, if you look at nature, the most stable shore form is crescent shape. And now that I've told this information, now you can go back on, whenever water touches land, if you go back and look at that shoreline, you will actually see that it's the most stable. It always come to go to create a crescent shape. That is a stable shore form. So this project, when we started this, we said, why don't we, instead of fighting nature, why don't we actually put something in here that nature likes? So we created those headland points on the picture. If you're facing the picture on the left side, we created a new headland point. And on the right side, there was an existing headland point that we actually beefed it up. The project was completed 2007. Now this is 2022. After all of those years, that protected shoreline you see there, it's actually become wider. What has happened is instead of fighting nature, we created an environment where sand is able to actually come in and deposit. Nature is able to deposit those sand in front of that shoreline. So instead of that shoreline becoming thinner and breaching, become wider and protected. Cost of that project was $450,000. $4.5 million, $450,000. Now, so the same thing was used here. The eroding shoreline, it was eroding at a rate of about 4 to 5 feet per year. We picked those headland points and we created those headland points. And this was done in 2010, 12 years later. Look at the cost, $200 a linear foot. And again, I'm not an engineer myself, so I always try to come up with terminologies that I can connect with, with the public. So this is a concept now. You see the design. If I call it Headland Breakwater Project, not many people are going to actually, latch on to what it means, right? So instead, I called it the crab claw design. You can see how the crab's claw, you're literally creating those crab claw. In essence, you're creating those headland point. So, communication is extremely important. Now, if I go and tell an average property owner that, hey, I'm going to actually put a crab claw design, they are able to latch onto that. There is a visual that comes to your mind instead of when I use, headland breakwater project. I might sound intelligent, but it doesn't mean anything to anybody. So so if anybody's going to use this term, there's going to be you're going to pay some royalties, but you know, make it yours. Now, this project is another project where we instead of creating a crab claw, this project, I would call it the whale, the whale's tail design. So if you can think of whales breaching, if you look at these beautiful pictures of whale breaching, you would see the tail sticking out. Basically, what this project looks like is we put structures in there, like three whale's tail design that we put in here on this shoreline, and and then again 2010 this project was put in place, until right now it's doing really, really well. So the whale's tail is a concept that, again, it basically, if you look at the shape between two of these whale tail design, is you'll come back to the same crescent shape. This is another project that we did in 2013. Again, you can see the trend. I'm going, these are all what I call innovative projects, pushing the envelope here. And again, when I want to communicate something to somebody, if I tell this design is not your typical living shoreline design, it is what is called a wishbone design. You can see on one side, on the left side, you can see those rock structure prominently visible. And on the other side, there are rock structures, but it's actually phased into, it's underneath that, the sand that is actually placed in there. Really quickly, this is another project. I want to show you this project here. This is called the Conquest Preserve, where this shoreline was getting battered by by a fetch of about 3 miles from the northeast. So when you have nor'easters, this shoreline was getting beat up every time there was a nor'easter. The Army Corps of Engineers put a proposal together, and one of them was putting a breakwater, the other one was putting a structural design, a revetment, and then there was a combination. Each of those options costed anywhere from $1 to $1.8 million. Now we come into picture and we said, okay, what do we do here? How do we actually work with nature here? Now, when you're not sure if you're able to see the shoreline really well on the left side, but if you look at the beach there, that exposed shoreline, you will see a lot of pebbles. So when we walked the shoreline, we looked at all of those pebbles, and it then hit us that the shoreline, what was happening for the shoreline is all the fine grain material was leaving the system, and what was left back is those big, pebbles. So what we did was, instead of trying to actually build the Great Wall of China or even the sill method or the crab claw or any of those things, all of those things were thought of. But then we said, this system, the fines are leaving and leaving behind the cobblestones. So why don't we do a living shoreline with cobblestones incorporated into the sand itself? So this project was done in almost 6 years ago. This beach has become wider, and it's doing really, really well, after 6 years. And look at the cost of the project, $271,000 as against $1 or $2 million. So after all of these things, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers started investing in what is called engineering with nature. So engineering with nature is basically an intentional alignment of natural engineering process, to actually create an environment that is sustainably, economic, environmental, and has social benefits. So that is basically something that is big now with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, last slide in conclusion, living shorelines is very, very effective in reducing, not stopping, and creating and restoring habitat. Working with nature is extremely crucial when you mimic nature, when you actually work with what she likes, you have a better chance of success. And the last take-home message is one size does not fit all. You have to actually be really, really clear as to what works on that shoreline. I've heard many, many examples. I've been to Connecticut, all over the country where people are like, "Oh, living shorelines work only in Maryland." And I always come back saying that, like, living shorelines is working with nature, working with that nature. If you have big rocky shorelines like the Northeast, what works in Maryland might not work there. So you would want to actually understand what is happening there and mimic that nature. And that is it. This is my contact information. What I'm doing now is basically taking all that years of experience of doing these projects on the ground, taking it to NOAA, and trying to actually, fund more research, physical research, and social science research to see how these projects can be put on the ground and make our communities more resilient. And that is it. If you guys have any
That's
questions.
fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing. So we like to open it up a little bit for questions that people might have or comments. But I see how this could really fit very nicely into some of the things that we're trying to explore with the teachers and really get them to link up the science, right? The environmental science in particular are often, and engineering. And so that's you're living this out. So that's awesome. Any questions?
There could be only two possibilities. Either you understood everything that came out of my mouth, or you didn't understand even one word. So I'm an optimistic person. I'll just think of the former as the reason for no questions.
Were you getting a lot of thumbs up and applause and all of that virtually anyway?
Oh,
so
awesome. I love those things. When
so
people talk about myself or talk about me, I love it more.
so I would say I've seen this in my own family. So we had a cottage on a reservoir in northern New York State, and we were positioned right in the spot. There's kind of like a bay where the when the ice would go out every year, we'd lose more shoreline, and quite a bit, and it was quite aggressive. And so my father tried to create the wall, like you're mentioning, and he had kind of a unique way he did it. Instead of like a normal break wall, he created baskets out of chain link fence. Somehow he found somebody with a chain link fence that had some issues, and he actually would kind of seam them together and made these baskets and put the rock in there. And you've seen that, I'm sure. I mean, I've seen
So
people.
that's called gabion baskets. Gabion
Yeah,
baskets are great. They're great in freshwater system. When you put gabion baskets in salty water, they tend to actually corrode, and
sure.
those, and then once it actually busts open, all the rocks becomes projectiles actually. So
Yeah.
you got to be really, really careful. So, like I said,
Yeah.
in Maryland, we've been doing this since the 70s, right? And I'm telling you, we've had some amazing successes and some colossal failures. The good thing is I have no shame at all. I talk about both of them, and the same vein, because we all learn not from successes, from failures. Failures are our best
Absolutely.
teacher. And so we've done that. And one of the other questions I usually get from engineers is, ice issues, right? So what happens when you have ice issues? Great Lakes, for instance, or the
Yep.
Northeast, you have big ice. So what we've done is, when you put these structures and these sills or drawings, these rock structures, they are not built like a wall. They're actually built as if you look at the cross section of it, it's a trapezoid,
Mm,
very broad bottom and, a flat top. And so when you look at these structures, when you have structures like this, right, this is almost like a trapezoid. And when this is the water side, this is the land side. And what happens is the water actually climbs up, crashes on that flat top, does not cause erosion, and just goes back. So, and engineers have actually tried to figure out what is the right angle that you have to actually put these structures in. Earlier they were done at, like a 1.5 to 1 slope. They realized that when you have ice sheets, like big ice sheets, there's been a lot of studies done on ice sheets. When the bay freezes over, the huge chunks of ice come and hit these structures. And if these structures are done at a 1 to 1, 1.5 to 1 slope, it comes and hits that structure and collapses. But when you have a 2 to 1 slope, it gradually goes and sits on it, right? But then it does not collapse because of the way the structure is. Because of the slope, it gives you more stability. So that is the first way that we've actually tackled ice. The second thing is when you put structures in place, we try to have at least two rocks touching at least 3 different points of contact. That's called a really, really close structure, right? When you have structures like that, the ice issue is not a huge issue. So whatever the problem is, we've already faced it, and we've kind of figured it out. Again, I'm sure there are more things to actually figure out, and that's the whole idea, is to have a community of practice. I saw the other word is community of practice on trails.
Yeah.
Is instead of just one person or one entity or one agency trying to actually tackle this, it's a combined effort, combined motivation to actually crack this nut.
Absolutely. And I know, I think our team we can go back and regroup and maybe even think about how we could potentially simulate some of this, or have a school experience, a class experience for students. It's a little bit of a challenge, because we're trying to enhance with the 3D printer piece. But we've done a number of things with kind of
rivers
and erosion along a river, things like that. We've got a lesson connected to that.
So
So
once you put 3D printing and this, you put them together, you have amazing opportunities. You can actually try to put these, and simulate a natural marsh in a tub, and try to actually show the students how a natural system, the 3D printing could be the rock component of it, and then you put sand behind it and grow some grasses and simulate, with a fan, you simulate water actually coming and hitting it, and then you can see how much ripples you have before it hits the structure, and after it's a lot calmer. So it's, things that you can actually do to show the power of nature.
yeah, those are awesome ideas. I think that's just excellent. And I love the various shapes, that you talked about, the wishbone, the whale's tail, the crab claw. And then when you spoke about the natural systems, the natural lay of the water, and Jim probably could relate to this, but maybe others could too, as an angler, as a fisherman, I recognize and know, like, you have to read a shoreline to know where good places to fish are. And so many of those shapes that you just showed, I see naturally in a shoreline anyway. And so, like you're saying, you're not fighting nature, you're complementing it, and working with it. And so that's pretty exciting to see, and knowing what's under the surface of the water, that will actually create good locations, for marine life, or for freshwater life as well. So that's awesome.
And many times when I've been to shorelines, and people are like, "Oh, I need a living shoreline." When I see a fallen tree, and somebody who fishes, when you have a fallen tree in the water, you know where the fish is hiding. That's the best place to actually fish. So I would look at a shoreline. You already have a living shoreline. Maybe it doesn't look beautiful, but it's functional.
Sure. Any other questions or comments before we finish up here?
Like I said, you can, whenever, feel free to actually use those terminologies, but there's a royalty you have to pay. We'll talk about it later.
That's great. Good
Just
luck
kidding.
with that. I'm trying to do that with my own published work, and I've not made a dime yet. So, anybody else? Any other thoughts or closing comments? Okay, I'm going to stop recording.